June 6th, 1944, D-Day. Overnight, thousands of planes roared across the English Channel, hundreds of ships gathered on the horizon, and more than 150,000 Allied soldiers went ashore on 5 beaches under withering fire. This was the largest seaborne invasion in history, and the moment that would change the course of World War II. But how did the Allies plan something so massive? What almost went wrong before dawn, and what did that landing actually cost? Let's take the full story from planning room to the last days of the Normandy campaign. Nothing left out. By 1943, the Allies knew they had to open a major Western front to relieve Soviet pressure in the east and begin pushing Nazi Germany back toward Berlin. The idea of a cross-channel invasion had been discussed for years. The final commitment and detailed planning accelerated through 1943 and early 1944. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower was named to lead the operation. The ground forces would be organized under British General Bernard Montgomery and U.S. commanders like Omar Bradley. The invasion plan was codenamed Operation Overlord. The seaborne invasion phase that everyone remembers, the landings on the beaches, was codenamed Operation Neptune. Planning, logistics, and deception. The scale of Overlord was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of men, tens of thousands of vehicles, months of buildup in southern England, and entirely new engineering solutions. The Allies developed artificial harbors called Mulberry Harbors to unload supplies where ports were unusable, and the Pluto pipeline under the ocean, to push fuel across the channel. Specialized armored vehicles, the famous Hobart's Funnies and amphibious Shermans, were ready to deal with obstacles and fortify positions on the beaches. Because the Germans expected an invasion, the Allies launched an elaborate deception program called Operation Bodyguard. Fake radio traffic, dummy armies, and false intelligence convinced German commanders that the main invasion might come at Pas-de-Calais or Norway, drawing forces away from Normandy. That deception was crucial. It helped prevent immediate German concentration against the invasion beaches. But planning alone doesn't win invasions. Weather decided the timetable. Eisenhower faced a brutal choice: go on June 5th despite poor conditions, or wait for a narrow window. Meteorologists predicted a brief improvement on June 6th, a one-day window, and Eisenhower authorized the attack. He even drafted a short note accepting responsibility in case the invasion failed. The night before in airborne operations. In the hours before dawn, airborne troops and glider units were the true gamble. U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne, British 6th Airborne, and other units were dropped or landed behind enemy lines to seize bridges, destroy defenses, and block German counterattacks. These operations were chaotic. Many units landed in the wrong fields, in the dark under fire, but the objectives were often achieved. Key causeways were held, bridges across the Douve and Orne rivers were captured, and German reaction was slowed. One famous success was the capture of Pegasus Bridge by British glider forces just minutes after midnight, a textbook small unit coup that secured the eastern flank. Dawn, the beach landings. On the morning of June 6th, Allied forces assaulted 5 named beaches from west to east. Utah, American 4th Infantry Division Bad Navigation initially pushed many troops south of their planned landing zone, but that turned into an advantage. American units found weaker defenses than expected and were able to move inland relatively quickly. Omaha, American 1st and 29th Divisions, this was the bloodiest, most iconic struggle. High bluffs, fortified positions, and interlocking fire created a killing zone. Pre-invasion bombardment failed to neutralize German bunkers. Landing craft were smashed on obstacles, and initial waves were pinned on the beaches. Small units, non-commissioned officers, and a few armored Shermans fought their way up narrow exits. By late afternoon, against terrible odds, American forces had secured footholds. Omaha was the point where the entire invasion nearly collapsed, and where extraordinary improvisation turned catastrophe into a hard-won success. Gold, British, 50th Division British troops faced strong resistance, but succeeded in linking to Juno and capturing key objectives, including a port area near Arromanches where the Mulberry Harbor would be sited. Juno, Canadian, 3rd Division Canadians hit heavier defenses than expected, suffered high casualties, but pushed inland farther than some of their British and American neighbors that day. Sword, British, 3rd Division, and airborne units to the east British forces secured much of their initial objectives, but failed to capture Caen D-Day. Caen would become a focal point for brutal fighting for weeks to come. By the end of June 6th, the Allies had assembled a tenuous but continuous beachhead stretching from Utah to Sword. Estimates vary, but roughly 156,000 Allied troops had landed that day, and casualties were heavy, several thousand killed and many more wounded. Precise numbers differ by source, but the human cost was real and immediate. The campaign in the Bocage, stalemate and attrition. D-Day secured the lodgment, but the war in Normandy was far from over. The hedgerow country, the Bocage, turned the countryside into a defender's dream. Narrow lanes, thick hedgerows, and German panzer and infantry counterattacks turned every field and village into a battle. Progress slowed to inches in places. The casualty rates stayed high. Allied commanders adapted tactics and equipment, and the Americans learned hard lessons about armor infantry cooperation and breaking through fortifications. Breakout, Operation Cobra, and the Falaise Pocket. The critical turning point after weeks of grinding fighting came in late July with Operation Cobra, the American plan to smash through German lines near St. Lo. Massive aerial bombardment and concentrated armored thrusts finally pierced the German defenses. Once the breakthrough happened, Allied armored divisions exploited the gap with breathtaking speed. That speed led to the Falaise Pocket in mid-August, where Allied forces encircled and destroyed a large portion of German Army Group B. Thousands of German troops were killed, wounded, or captured. Many more escaped in chaotic withdrawal, but without heavy equipment. The destruction of those forces effectively ended organized German resistance in Normandy and opened the road to Paris. On August 25, 1944, Paris was liberated. By the end of August, the Normandy campaign, the bloody business that began on June 6th, had concluded with an Allied victory, heavy cost, and a decisive strategic shift. Consequences: strategic, political, human. What did Overlord accomplish? Strategically, it opened a large, permanent Western front that forced Germany to fight a two-front war in earnest. For the Soviet Union, it relieved some pressure and validated Allied commitments, though political tensions would later surface over speed and priorities. Militarily, the campaign destroyed or rendered ineffective a huge portion of German forces in the West and gave the Allies the ports and lines of communication to push across France and into Germany. The human consequence was enormous. Thousands of Allied soldiers died or were wounded. German losses in Normandy were catastrophic in manpower and material. French civilians paid a heavy price. Towns and countryside were destroyed, and civilian casualties from bombing and shelling were tragically high. The liberation also restored hope and resistance movements across occupied Europe. There were controversies and debates that followed over the timing of the invasion, the use of strategic bombing in the run-up, missed opportunities, and command disagreements among Allied leaders. Those debates are still studied by historians and military professionals today. Why it matters? D-Day was not a single moment of triumph or a simple amphibious landing. It was the opening of a vast, complicated campaign that combined sea power, air power, ground forces, deception, engineering, and improvisation. It was planned for years, gambled on by weather and leadership, paid for in blood, and finished by months of grinding combat. In the end, it broke Nazi control of Western Europe and set the Allies on the road to victory. Which single decision do you think mattered most on D-Day? Eisenhower's weather call, the airborne operations, the deception plan, or the grit of soldiers at Omaha? Tell us in the comments. I'll read and respond. If you want a deep dive into Omaha or into how Mulberry Harbors worked and were constructed, say which one, and I'll make the next video.